I'm not quite sure how to do this video. Uh, Videos aren't really my forte. Electronics is, in computers. But you need to watch the first 3 minutes of this man's video that I have linked below in the description. Only the first 3 minutes. I just ate up the rest of his video after the 3 minute mark, but that's a little technical, as he does say. This is Pawel an iNav builder and one of the smartest men in the universe to me. A very nice gentleman, very knowledgeable, trying to help us all. He's just a big part of this industry, period, in my humble opinion. If you watch the first 3 minutes of Pawel's video and come back to my video, then I think this will be understandable. Without that, I don't know from what I'm going to tell you it's going to be understandable at all. I'll try my best. And it will be easier. What I say will be easier to understand, and if you do watch the first 3 minutes of Pawel's video. And Mr. Pahowski, I hope I didn't mispronounce your name if you ever see this, because I had no intention of doing that to the man who helps me a lot, even if he actually doesn't know it. So at this point in my video, I'm going to assume and hope that you watched the first 3 minutes of that video. What he was talking about was timers on the RC channels when I was looking around for how to move motors and servos around an iNav. This is the documentation for the 765 wing. And I was always bothered by this chart right here on the left. Oops. This one right here. Oops. If I try to highlight that, it highlights all of this over here too, so I'll stop that. This chart right here bothered the daylights out of me. And I really didn't want to deal with it because I didn't understand it until 24, 48 hours ago. Got this iNav airplane, iNav multi-rotor, got ArduPilot over here being talked about. So iNav, Ardu. If you watch Pawel's video, you now know, probably got an inkling of what I'm going to say here. Because as he told you, let me go down to another place that this is referenced and all this. That'd be right here. And as he said, when trying to move your motors, servos around an iNav, there's restraints because of the timers. Because this is in the Maytech F765 documentation, and in reviewing his video just now, I heard him say on certain firmware, on some flight controllers. So I think it varies from flight controller to flight controller. But I also think because Ardu has implemented resource mapping, RC channel mapping, that they don't have the constraints that iNav has. Let's go back and talk about this just a little bit by looking at my iNav setup where I was trying to move the Mini Talon motor and servos around to match the ArduPlane setup. And it was just becoming really, really difficult. And Mr. Pahowski did finally convince me to go the other way. Set it all up in ArduPlane where it's just easy to assign anything you want to any channel. And wire it for iNav even though you're flying ArduPlane. That way when you're flying an iNav, it's just running the wired the way iNav expects it to be wired. Ardu, we just do RC1, 2, 3, and 4. Doesn't matter. The things I'm telling you don't seem to be a problem. But I had a problem when I was doing the mini Talon in the last week or so where I saw some hesitation in the surface movements of my ArduPlane that I didn't see in my iNav setup. My iNav, the surfaces were just being proportional with my stick movements right and left. Even my last video addresses that a little bit because I'm still thinking about how I was going to do this video, how I was going to share this information. When I did the iNav setup and wiring and setup, I had just perfect surface movements. Now I have gone back now and wired it in ArduPlane for iNav, the way iNav says to wire it, which shouldn't be a problem in our ArduPlane. But I did also go back and rewire it as Ardu would wire it, RC1, 2, 3, and 4 straight up, and check that proportional hesitation that I had seen before, and I couldn't duplicate it again. I still worry that it's there. Now let me tell you why. Pawel told us that we can't mix timers. So I cannot put a motor on RC1 and a servo on RC2. That's on timer 2. You can't share, like it says right here. Motors can't share same timers with a servo. So you can't have a motor on 3 and a servo on 4. Same thing with 5, 6. If you have a motor on 7, you can't put servos on 8, 9, or 10. If you had a single motor, and you see this in the iNav wiring where they have the motor on 1, in ArduPlane they have the motor on 3, but we see this in iNav where we have the motor on 1 on timer 2, internal hardware timer, and we have the first servo on 3, starting on 3. I've seen it even worse, which I'll illustrate in a few minutes. So that's why S2 is open on the iNav wiring. So for Ardu, which would have the aileron on 1, VTEL on 2, motor on 3, VTEL the other VTEL on 4, because Ardu implemented resource mapping, RC mapping, only a few versions ago. I think that happened maybe, I'll have to go back and look. We may go back and look here in 2020, 2019. It is recently. It is very recently. So he says that you can't put a motor on 3 and a servo on 4 on timer 5. It will not work. Now, he didn't go deep into this. He's warning you. If you put, in my humble opinion, if you put a motor on 3 with a 400 hertz timing and a servo on 3 with a 400 hertz timing, I think you're going to be okay. That's my personal opinion from 50 years in electronics and my understanding of how timers work, hardware, software, all that good stuff. But like he said, if you have a motor here at 8 kilohertz and try to put a servo on at 400 hertz or 400 kilohertz, whatever, a different timing scheme. You can't do that on the same timer without resource mapping, RC mapping. And the reason I can do this in ArduPlane is because they have implemented that. That's why I can have ailerons, left VTEL, motor, right V-tail. I can have motor and right V-tail on uh, 3 and 4, timer 5 without problem. Now see, I still in the back of my mind going, Pawel's smarter than I am. If he says you can't mix these, maybe I shouldn't be mixing these in ArduPlane. I should not wire ailerons left V-tail motor, right V-tail in ArduPlane. If my surfaces, I'm flying up there and my surfaces lock up for a half a second, is that going to crash my plane? Is that going to cause problems? So I'm more entitled to go with what Pawel says than what 50 years of my experience says. But who knows? I may send this video to him and say, review this and clarify this for me. I understand everything you're saying, but I have these little points so far. Yes, if the timing is the same, you could mix them, but he's not going to confuse layman's and non-electronics people by saying that. He's an intelligent man. He's a good man. In my humble opinion, what they have done at INAV is they've protected you from this problem, as you can see, of mixing a motor on timer. Oops, which one was the first one? On timer 2. And nobody really needs to know these timer numbers. You never, you don't assign them or nothing, not even an ArduPlane. But this is for discussion. So you can't mix a motor on S1 and a servo on S2. We're going to stick with the firm and assume that these are not items with exactly the same timing requirements. In my humble opinion, if they have the same timing constraints, it'll work. But because I think Pawel knows more than I do, I worry about putting a motor on 3 and a servo on 4 in ArduPlane. Am I going to have a problem in the future because those are sharing timer 5? Am I only going to have a problem if they have different timer constraints? I don't know. This right here, and the man that I think knows more than most people in the world, puts doubt in my mind about my 50 years of experience, whether I'm right on that. They can actually be shared. I have shared them in this hardware on ArduPlane and had no problem. Is that because they have used resource mapping and RC mapping? That's the things I don't know. And besides going back and keep wiring it like ArduPlane and is testing it to find if it locks up the control surfaces momentarily again, I just haven't been able to reproduce what I think I saw at one time yet. I will continue to try. So that was one of the things that kept me from wiring this platform for ArduPlane by going aileron, left V-tail, motor, right V-tail. And that is why when this sets up here, it blocks you from assigning S2 as a servo. You can assign it as another motor. And you remember, if I add the third one, it doesn't jump around these servos. So see, in my humble opinion, if we look back at this chart, you could put the third motor, see, 1, 2, you'd have to, you can't put the third motor on 3, 4 or 5 because they're already assigned to servos, and you can't put it on 6 either because 6 can't share a motor with the servo that's already on 5. But you could put it on 7, in my humble opinion. This just didn't assign motor 3 anywhere up here, but I think it could go right here on 7 if there was somehow 2 motors on each wing and then a motor on the vertical stabilizer in the back. You couldn't use 6 because you can't share the timer that the servo is on. Is this making any sense? Am I making any sense? We can delete this back down, and if we add another motor 3 or motor 4, we've got a B52 model now where we've got 4 motors, 2 on each wing. It doesn't assign them anywhere up here, but I think you could put it on, it would work here on 8. So the software didn't allow me directly to set it up as ArduPlane is wired. So I wired for ArduPlane as iNav is wired. Motor, aileron, left VTEL, right VTEL. And like I say, I can easily go in and assign those that way in ArduPlane because ArduPlane lets you. In my humble opinion, because they've done RC mapping, resource mapping. But I still fear that Pawel is more correct on the hardware portion right here in this list, this chart, that has bothered me, like I said, since day one, looking at this hardware document, data sheet. This chart right here in this upper left-hand corner that I looked at and went, boy, don't want to deal with that. I'm just going to ignore it. I'm sure it will go away. Well, it didn't. So again, iNav uses motor. They don't put the next servo here because you can't share it on timer 2. So we get servo, servo, servo. Whereas in ArduPlane, it's servo, servo, motor, servo, and timer 5 is sharing a motor and a servo on the same timer. Because I can't reproduce what I think I saw at one point with some hesitation in the servos that could be caused by my ArduPlane motor being on 3 and a servo being on 4, I decided the safest thing to do was to wire it for iNav and configure it inside ArduPlane differently so I can fly each platform with the same wiring, because I can't seem to find a way to do it the other direction. Can't move, because no matter how I do it with only 4 channels, the first 4 channels, I'm going to be sharing, well, I could put it, no, I can't do that. No, I'm going to shut up. I start saying because I've only got 1 motor and them 4 channels, it's just not able to do it. So that's some of the stuff that I ran into when trying to make this setup the same as Ardu, so I wouldn't have to switch these wires around between platforms. Now, as I've got it, all I have to do is bring it in. While I'm changing the battery out, I can stick the USB cable in it, start flashing it for iNav, still changing the battery out. iNav firmware uploads. As I'm slipping the new battery in or whatever, I can reinstall the dump file, and be ready to fly iNav in the field without any changes other than flashing the firmware and restoring my configuration. No wiring changes. That's why I did it. The reason I am making this video is that I still fear that any ArduPlane, I fear that iNav people are going to branch out into ArduPlane like I'm branching out into iNav, And if resource mapping by ArduPlane does not solve this problem, which from what Pawel said, I think it does for ArduPlane, not for iNav yet, because they haven't done that resource mapping, that it could cause a crash. And I don't want to see iNav people moving out into their first ArduPlane platform and being just down in the mouth because their plane just went crazy. Because until I started looking for how to move this stuff around, I had never viewed Pawel's video. I didn't know, again, I'll admit it, all day long. I had seen this chart, but it scared me. I went, well, that's really complex. What the hey? But now I fully understand it. I guess they're showing a hexacopter here. And if we go back now and look, if I go up here and I load flying wing and say load and apply the mixer settings, we begin to see what Pawel's talking about and what I'm talking about are the same thing. Notice here where we have motors 1 and 2 on timer 2 and timer 5 is doing servos, 2 servos. It's perfect. The iNav software, who Pawel is programming for, doesn't have to protect you from sharing a servo and a motor here with the iNav configurator, because it's not a problem in this case. Got motor 1 and 2, and here down here's servo 3 and servo 4. I mean, what the hey? No problem whatsoever. Let's look at another one real quick. See what this one does real quick with aileron, 2 aileron servos. Take a nap while that works. Looky here. It also keeps you away from sharing servo with the motor on timer 2. I started to say 5 until I looked back at it real quick. And if you do add another rule to this mix, yes, it does pop a motor up on 2 because it can. But if you add a third motor, it doesn't pop up anywhere. So, in my opinion, Pawel and his development team for the software iNav and configurator stuff are protecting you from doing something you shouldn't. Therefore, they prevented me from wiring my iNav setup exactly like it was in ArduPlane, because no matter how hard I try, I'm not going to be able to share a motor on a timer. And if having my motor on 3 and a right VTEL on 4 in ArduPlane isn't sharing timer 5, I don't know what would be. So if we look again at some of these other things real quick, airplane without a rudder, that's back to the exact same setup as basically had before. It's going to be the same amount of servos as the VTEL, but it's not going to be split because they're not sharing pitch and roll. So this basically output map up here is the same as my VTEL down here, instead of being aileron, and then 4 boxes here, two of 3 and 2 of 4 sharing the roll and yaw. It's exactly the same. Let's, for kicks and grins, look at some, well, right here for kicks and grins, let's look at a tricopter. It has 3 motors. And I'm going to tell you straight up, right now I don't understand this one. Every time I think I have a little understanding, the world slaps me around. So here is 3 motors on a quadcopter. 1, 2, 3. These are sharing timer 2. This is on timer, I think it's 5. Yes, it's on timer 5. This is on timer 1, was it? I don't see why they skipped this right here, because that would be timer 1, and 5 or 6 have nothing on them. I really think you could have put that servo on 5 instead of 7, but iNav is moving it way up here to servo slot, output slot, whatever this is up here. S7, although it's the RC5. So they completely skipped over this timer that S5 and S6 share, and had to for S4 because it had a motor on it. They couldn't do the servo. So see, that right there just blew me out of the water a little bit. I figured this would be back here on 5. Does that make sense to you? And if we look a little more at multi-rotors for kicks and grins, here's a quad. And, boy, I might not should have chosen this one. Because in my humble opinion, well, no, I started saying my humble opinion, they're starting to do a little RC channel mapping. And that's why you can actually come in on this quad and move them 4 motors around. But that's not so. The reason you can move these 4 motors around is because you're not sharing servos with motors on any of the timers. So you can do anything you want in that case. So this really isn't done because resource mapping. This is done because there's just all motors and no timers. And you can see your motors are down through here and with no servos. And in the case, we'll get off of that quad of my Hexa flame wheel. Notice that special wizard went away. It's only for quads. Right now, I suspect they're working on this in the background. They're not going to tell us everything they're working on and let us kibitz on whether they should be working on that or something else. They've got their heads down doing work. This is exactly the same thing. It's all motors, so there's no sharing of servos. No servos in this at all. So in my humble opinion, there's the way the timers go. This timer 2 has 2, timer 5 has 2, timer 1 has 2, but timer 4 has 4 servo slots. And timer 9 down here has 2. See, this one has 4s a little. This is because that's the way the hardware is set up. This has nothing to do with software. This is the way the hardware is set up. When the hardware timers are wired like this, Pawel and his development team have to work within those hardware constraints for their timing in software. It's written in stone when that chip and board is created. They can't switch it around. Now, they can work around it with software, with resource mapping, but they're not quite ready to do that. I honestly think they've got it in the back of their mind, and they keep going, but we've got other things that we can work on first that'll make the overall program really, really brilliant, and then we'll go back and add these other things when the basic stuff is nice and shiny. And then there's always the other thing that a lot of us programmers worry about. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Next thing you know, you've got a mess. So right now, I think they want to leave it as it is, work on other things, get them where they want them to be, and then perhaps do some resource mapping. So let's go in again and see if we can find another mixing. I don't see what would be strange to me. Oh yeah, this would work. Let me see if I can find an octa. And the reason I'm looking for an octocopter is because it's going to have 8 motors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So see, 8 motors is only going to take up 2 of the 4, the first 2 of the 4 of timer 1. So what if we want to put servo on it for a camera tilt? I bet you dollars to donuts it's going to pop up on S11 because I won't be able to use 9 and 10 because I can't share motors and servos on the same timer. So there we are. We've got our six motors. We're supposed to have 8. What the hell? There's 8. There's 8 motors here. Oh, here we go. Oh, look at that. This already jumped over timer 4 for some reason. And I bet you dollars to donuts the brilliance and intelligence of the iNav programmer said, well, we could talk to them about all this crazy timer stuff. And because there's 8 motors on this platform, it would just be confusing to them if we let them put it, part of it, on this timer. So we're just going to push the other motors out here and then leave them these 4 slots for 4 servos. And there'll be less confusion and less problems. I would do that if I was programming it. So right now, if I come in here and I add a servo for my pan and tilt, the tilt portion, look, it pops up on 7 just like I suspected it would. Now, I don't have complete and utter understanding of VTEL quad. What the hell? Oh, yeah, I've seen them before. But I think I have enough understanding of what was going on in this that I made my best choice for rewiring my ArduPlane to be wired like iNav is wired rather than trying to make iNav wired as ArduPlane is wired, because you can't do it. You just can't do it. You can't mix motors and servos on one timer. Let's see, VTEL. Yeah, it's just 4. I didn't. So I also wanted to give the people who might potentially move out into ArduPlane for the first time or be doing ArduPlane and iNav like I am, from doing something that might cause their airplane to crash. I thought it was my duty to, even though I don't fully understand it, is to make you aware of it so you can make your own informed decisions on this. And I don't know, I do crazy things sometimes. I may send a copy of this link to Pawel and say, hey, review this and see if I'm fully understanding what you're saying. And what I said to these people is true, that it won't be a problem in Ardu, and it could be a problem in iNav if you tried to wire it like ArduPlane. I don't know what I'll do. But I thought, armed with this information, again, when I went out to try to wire my platform, not have to move my wires around when switching between the platforms. These constraints right here of motors and servos can't share a timer, with that caveat that is mine, not Pawel's, that if they have exactly the same timing, it won't be a problem. I think Pawel might agree with me. Yes, you're right. If they're both 400 hertz, 40 hertz, 4 gigahertz, 400 gigahertz, it won't be a problem. But if one of them is different, there could be enough of a problem to burn up a motor or servo due to timing issues. So this is why, like I say again, this is why I wired my platform for iNav even though I'm going to fly it in ArduPlane first and then come back to our iNav later, because I couldn't really do it in iNav until I found this video of Pawel's. Right here. This video. Whoops. Not supposed to share or do somebody else's video, or I get in trouble with YouTube. I don't understand that quite yet. I wanted to ask Pawel's permission to share part of his video and then incorporate part of his video in my video, but my understanding is if you do that, then, well, my first up understanding was if I didn't ask Pawel if I could do it up front, I might insult him, and I wouldn't want to do that. I've accidentally shared some other people's stuff without asking up front, but I haven't gotten in trouble yet. I'd rather ask permission up front than forgiveness later myself. And until I went looking for resource mapping, how to move motors, servos, and stuff in iNav, I had never seen any documentation on this timer problem from any other source than, again, this information right here, which I just didn't want to deal with, because it isn't spoke about much in Matec's documentation, except for right here where it says motor can't share same timer with servo. But I think that is in iNav, not in ArduPlane, but I'm not 100% sure. So you can go down through the whole rest of this, that's the bottom of the information, and you are not going to see anything. And then I also saw in the hardware how this servo connection was split out on the board by itself here. I'm sure it's because they needed to drill this hole in it someplace, but I always wondered why that was split out. It may just simply be because they wanted to drill a hole there. But I didn't find any other references to wiring, sharing a timer with channels and timers and stuff until I saw Pawel's video by going out and looking for information on my desire to switch around those servos. And it was from 2018. That's only 2 years ago. And I really don't think they've done resource mapping since then, so I still think this constraint is still in effect because of the hardware. Matec says, like I say, I couldn't reproduce that when I wired the 765 wing for ArduPlane, aileron, left VTEL, motor, and right VTEL sharing the RC timer on RC 3 and 4. Couldn't duplicate it as being a problem, and I think it is part of the hardware. I think it's just because resource mapping is available in ArduPlane, and I don't think I would have felt really good if I had heard of people wiring it up and having their platform crashed. So I at least wanted to make you aware of this information. This is why I did the wiring the way I did, and until 48 hours ago I had no idea how important this right here was, because iNav configurator seems to keep you from putting a motor and a servo on the same timer so you don't get in trouble with iNav. Okay, I hope you get something out of this. Some will, some won't. I don't think a lot need it. A lot aren't doing trying to do everything I'm trying to do with all this stuff at the same time. So, all right. Have a good one, guys. Thank you so much.